So the recommendation is 5 tablespoons of bleach per gallon of water to disinfect those surfaces that you're using to move things around on your farm. And so what do you need to disinfect? You need to, make sure those harvest baskets are clean. Preferably, you want to have something or a container that can be washed inside and out. Anything that's porous like a basket is not really something you can technically wash. Bags, aprons, knives, anything that you use on a daily basis, it's a good idea, a good habit to get into to wash those after each use. And again, this is really to protect you more so than anything, because COVID-19 is not a foodborne pathogen. But again, especially if you have other employees on your farm, you need to be extra diligent about washing those fabrics and that sort of thing. Also, any touch surfaces that you're, around the house, around the farm, door handles, steering wheels on your vehicles, touch screens and keyboards. Those are all things that you need to, try to clean throughout the day, especially if you have multiple employees using those tools. Just some general hygiene recommendations for workers on the farm. You want to have a way to wash your hands throughout the day. So if you don't have a sink nearby, come up with a sanitizing station or something out there in the field on the back of the truck or something like that. Again, having that is really important, especially when people take breaks and things like that. I would probably prohibit anybody from smoking and that sort of thing during the day, especially on the farm. Because again, every time they're touching their mouth, they're potentially spreading all kinds of things besides just COVID-19. If you have the ability to give every employee their own tools, don't share those tools, that would be an ideal situation. Gloves are a good idea when handling food as a general practice, even on the farm. And they should be changed anytime they're contaminated. So anytime you touch your face, or if you have to touch the ground for some reason and get dirt on those gloves, you need to change those gloves is basically what it boils down to. And again, if for some reason the task that you're doing interferes with your ability to harvest or whatever, then you need to have hand washing and hand sanitizer going on frequently throughout the day, and take those breaks to wash intentionally. Some workers on the farm may prefer to wear masks if you have to hire folks to come in, especially, and that's actually a good practice. That's something that you can encourage. It's not required according to the CDC, but it should be something that you can definitely encourage them to do and make sure that they're wearing them properly to prevent any illness from spreading on the farm. So kind of shifting gears here from COVID-19 to just general foodborne illnesses. Foodborne illness is still a real threat to any operation, as much or more so than COVID-19. And again, a lot of the practices that we do for foodborne illnesses also work for COVID-19 as well. So just to kind of give you some background, foodborne illnesses in the United States, about 1 out of every 6 Americans each year is going to be affected by a foodborne illness. And so that could, you're looking at potentially over 55,000, hospitalizations as a result of foodborne illnesses, and 3,000 deaths. Of course, if y'all are tracking COVID-19, these statistics pale in comparison to COVID-19, but it's still something that we want to reduce, those deaths and those hospitalizations, especially when COVID-19 is going on too. Last thing we need to do is send more people to the hospital in Cartersville or anywhere else. So think about, the bigger picture too. So what is foodborne illness? It's basically any disease that's caused by food that you eat that's contaminated, essentially. So now we're talking about different things like salmonella, listeria, Yersinia, E. coli. Those are things that you hear about in the news all the time, showing up in produce, and they'll have to do recalls at grocery stores and that sort of thing. We're also talking about foodborne illnesses from other viruses like a norovirus. That's your cruise ship virus that a lot of people are familiar with. Illnesses caused by parasites. So one of the big ones is called Cryptosporidium. That one's transmitted by birds, especially migratory birds. Cyclospora is another one that's a parasite, and Toxoplasma. You hear about toxoplasma with cats, especially with individual women that are pregnant are a high risk for toxoplasma, and they tell them don't clean out the litter box and that sort of thing. So again, how do you reduce the risk to parasites? Think about reducing migratory birds and then around your farm pond and that sort of thing that may be in close proximity to where you're growing produce. You don't want wild cats walking through your produce areas where you're trying to grow or handle those products. So again, those are all things that you can minimize introducing these pathogens into your production. And there are also parasites, specifically protozoans like Giardia. That's a big one that's a lot of times waterborne. So if you're washing your produce with contaminated water, that can be a big issue. Okay. So these are all some examples of traditional foodborne illnesses that we have to worry about. So obviously, the big deal is, it can cause some symptoms with any of these or complications. And the complications could be severe, stillbirths, abortion, your high-risk populations, the elderly and the very, very young are at high risk to some of these complications. And death is a real possibility with any of these as well, especially with those high-risk populations. So it's just as serious as COVID-19. And we need to, do whatever we can to minimize contamination of our produce. And then you also have to think about personal liability issues, right? If somebody gets hospitalized or if they die, here's some average awards that you're looking at as far as court cases. So I guess the question you need to ask yourself is, if you did something negligent and you were found to have contaminated produce, do you have $100,000 sitting around that you could settle a case like this? And not only that, but it's not just you that's going to be affected by this. It's going to be the entire farmers market because we don't have a good tracing system a lot of times at farmers markets to be able to determine, which farm it came from. So it's not just going to affect you; it's going to affect the entire farmers market. So again, realize that we all are in this together essentially, and we got to do a good job of preventing these foodborne pathogens. As far as outbreaks, there's a lot of examples of these over the last 10, 20 years. Approximately 72 reported outbreaks of foodborne illness associated with 20 fresh produce commodities between 1996 and 2007. Some of them were domestic outbreaks, some of them were imported food products. What's interesting is a lot of these are products that you're going to be selling at the market. 13 of those were associated with tomatoes. Okay, a lot of y'all are growing tomatoes. 11 out of those outbreaks were associated with melons, like watermelons. 24 associated with leafy greens, things like lettuce and spinach. Greens are much higher risk because you're not cooking that a lot of times. Even tomatoes and melons, those are fresh products that you generally aren't going to be cooking. So those are much, much higher risk products than other things that are going to be cooked. So again, you need to take extra precautions with all produce, but especially these that are eaten fresh. So here's the problem and why it's such a potential risk with foodborne pathogens. Once a product is contaminated, it's difficult, if not impossible, to remove that contamination. So what these pictures are showing here are the leaves of a plant, essentially under a microscope. You'll see these little holes in the leaves are called stomates, and they're little pores in the skin of those leaves on the plant, also on the surface of fruits, and they're there for gas exchange in that plant. And essentially, it allows gases to go in and out. It's going to trap those gases and water droplets inside. So realize that contamination is not just on the surface of the produce. If you get contamination from water, especially inside these pores, it's going to be trapped inside, and there's no way to clean that product. You can't wash that off. So that's something that, again, the only way to avoid this is to minimize or avoid contamination in the first place. Produce can also be contaminated through cut areas. So anywhere a stem or a leaf is broken, you can see these little arrows on the screen where they show the E. coli that's showing up from a test that they did. So anywhere there's a broken spot in the lettuce, or if they actually cut or broke the edge of that leaf, those are areas, those are cracks and crevices that allow those pathogens to get inside the product again. So cut produce obviously is considered a potentially hazardous food, which is why we don't want cut produce at the market. You don't want to sell half melons that are already cut because that's a hazardous food. As soon as you cut that open, that requires temperature control, and it has to be consumed within 2 hours. It can't be sitting out any longer than that, and you have to throw it away after 2 hours, basically. So we generally, don't. If you're a produce vendor, you're not supposed to be cutting and selling that at the market, is what it boils down to. You have to sell whole melons and whole products that are not cut. So the goal is, again, don't let produce get contaminated in the first place, and handle, those products on the farm in a way that minimizes the growth of harmful pathogens. And one of the key ways to do that is through refrigeration, which is going to minimize the growth of any pathogens in those products. Another thing you need to think about is, are you using any organic fertilizer sources? There's a survey that was done that looked at farms. 57% of the respondents indicated they use some sort of manure on the farm, and realized that manure is not a bad thing. It's essentially a free source of fertilizer, if you will, but it has potential risk if you're not using it properly. So you can see a lot of people use poultry litter. Up to 45% of those that use manure on their farms are using poultry litter. Cattle manures are pretty common as well. You can even use goat manure, bat guano in some cases if you have access to something like that. Most interesting response was there was one person that said they use human manure. Hate to tell you this, but that one's off limits. That should be a red flag to everybody. That's not something we need to be using on any farm, anywhere, and that is not approved for organic production. So just realize that some things are a higher risk than others. So, some basic steps to keep your product safe, minimize human pathogens in the soil. Probably the biggest concern there would be, what's your proximity to a septic tank or a leach field in your backyard? You don't need to be growing anywhere on top of that or near that. I'd want to say, stay at least 100 feet away from a leach field, again, to minimize those human pathogens. Follow safe guidelines as far as manure use. So the EPA actually recommends, as well as USDA for the organic certification program, a waiting period between raw manure application and the harvest period. So basically you're looking at 90 days between application to crops that don't touch the soil. So things like tomatoes that you're caging and keeping those off the ground, or corn, you still need to wait 90 days before you harvest those between the last application of manure. And those crops that do touch the soil, you're looking at a minimum of 120 days. And I think, I'd err on the side of caution with that even more so. I would even lean towards, if you're going to grow root crops, put your manure in, let's say the season prior, maybe put it in the fall and then plant your crop in the spring. That way you've had a whole season between where that can break down and minimize any contamination of those root crops. And then other things that you need to do to stay clean, if you're going to use compost, make sure you're composting properly. What are you putting in that compost? Generally, you don't want to put any meats, manure and things like that in that compost unless you're composting it properly. Definitely don't want to put, cat, dog, or human feces in a compost pile. Those are things you want to avoid. And keep that pile size at least 5 by 5. That's a minimum size for it to be able to heat up properly. To that temperature needs to get to about 130 to 170 degrees in that pile to actually pasteurize it and kill those pathogens. Also part of that is, we could do a whole class on composting, but realize that you got to have things balanced out in that pile. Your carbon to nitrogen ratio has to be 25-1. If you get too much brown stuff, that carbon stuff in there, it's not going to decompose. It's not going to heat up. You've also got to have a little bit of nitrogen in there. Sometimes adding a nitrogen fertilizer can help accelerate that pile and allow it to heat up a little bit faster. And you want to turn that and make sure there's air in that pile so it'll accelerate that decomposition as well. So again, there's a lot of good guidelines on composting. If you want to do it in windrows on a larger scale, we have a really good publication from the University of Georgia that talks about how to do that properly. It's also a good idea to track your temperatures in those piles with a thermometer as well. Water is a big one on the farm that you need to think about. Well water is preferred for irrigation uses on edible crops versus surface water. Surface water obviously is very easily contaminated. There's not an easy way to treat that in most farm situations. Trying to chlorinate that on the farm is going to be both dangerous and expensive to do on a small scale. So it's better to have a well that's a protected wellhead that's deep enough to avoid any contamination. But even with a well, you want to monitor the water quality at least once a year. You want to test that well. We have bacteria tests at the county extension office that you can pick up. It's $46 to test your well water. And again, you might want to even do that more often or right before your season starts up, just to make sure your well water is still clean. A lot of folks will shock chlorinate that well as a routine procedure. Once a year you could shock chlorinate that. It's literally putting bleach into that wellhead, letting it sit, and then flushing it out. We have a great publication from the University of Georgia if you want to learn about how to shock chlorinate your well, how much bleach is required to do that safely. And again, make sure that that well is clean, and then do a follow-up test after you do that shock chlorination treatment. So again, that's a good idea to get in the habit of doing that with a well. As a general rule of thumb, you want to use water that's safe to drink, that you would actually drink to rinse your fruits and vegetables. So if you're using municipal water or county water that's already chlorinated, you have nothing to worry about there. But if you're using well water, you're responsible for testing that and checking that. And as a general rule, I'd probably avoid any other surface water, ponds and things like that to irrigate with, unless you could do drip irrigation. That would be the exception. If you can irrigate out of a pond and use drip irrigation, then you're not getting that water on the actual crop. Of course, that wouldn't work for root crops, but for tomatoes and corn and things that stay off the ground, that would be a good practice. And you still want to wait at least 2 weeks after the last application prior to harvest to minimize any carryover of those pathogens onto the product that you're harvesting. And of course, in your fields, you want to keep pets and farm animals and wild animals, especially the migratory birds, out of that field, out of that irrigation source, whatever it is. If it is a farm pond, you need to keep animals out of there to minimize that pathogen load as well. So some other things just to reiterate, good personal hygiene in the field and in packing houses. Make sure you go to work with clean clothes on. Don't wear jewelry. Don't eat while you're out there working on the job. Again, you don't want to touch your mouth because that's a high risk situation. And again, teach your workers how to hand wash properly throughout the day. And I think most of y'all know you can, need to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. You can see the pictures down there. But it's a process, and you got to learn that process and get in the habit of doing it properly. Some other steps to keep your product safe on the farm. Obviously, you want to exclude any sick workers from handling that product. If they are sick, they need to wait at least 24 hours and be symptom-free before coming back to work or harvesting and handling any food products on your farm. If they've had jaundice, they really should wait until they get a doctor's release before they come back to work and handle any food products. If they have a sore throat or just a minor issue, then maybe you could reassign them to something else on the farm, pulling weeds or something instead of harvesting that crop. Let's try to keep them out of the food until they get better. And again, I know most of y'all are probably not big enough to have to worry about providing bathroom facilities, but if you're in a large field situation, you would have to have bathroom facilities within a quarter mile from each worker in the field or in a packing shed situation. As far as washing and sanitizing those work surfaces, and this is back at the barn, if you have packing areas and that sort of thing, you need to pressure wash those areas. You need to clean them with detergent. and then there's a sanitizer you'd want to use at the end. So the steps for that, basically, if you're cleaning any of your facilities or your equipment, the first thing you want to do is rinse it to get all the dirt off, because we can't sanitize dirt. You got to get the dirt off first. And then once the dirt is removed, then you can wash it. And you're washing with a detergent at that point, some sort of a soap. And then you want to rinse again to remove the detergent off of that surface, okay? And then after you've removed the detergent, then you want to use a sanitizer. So that's the last step and the most important step. But again, sanitizer does not work if you have dirt or detergent on that surface. So make sure you take the time to go through those different steps. As far as sanitizers, you can use household bleach at 200 parts per million. You're looking at 1 tablespoon per gallon of water for those food contact surfaces. Any surface that's not contacting food, you can use 400 parts per million, which is 2 tablespoons per gallon of water. Again, just to kind of recap, we want to practice good personal hygiene, clean and sanitize that equipment. Make sure you label your containers so you can trace them back to a particular field or a date of harvest. Have at least some traceability, even on a small farm. That's a good idea. Have some records to track that product. Wash your produce before entering the packing facility, using different containers for each field to separate that before it goes to market. Again, the more you can separate things and avoid cross-contamination, that's a good idea. With your transporting those products, and even right out of the field, if you're going to have to store them overnight, if you're picking it the day before, you need to think about storage and how are you storing that. The sooner you can get the heat off of that product, the better. That's going to not only preserve the quality of that product, but it's also going to enhance the safety of that produce from a foodborne pathogen standpoint. Lower temperatures are going to obviously lower the growth rate of those microorganisms. Most products can be stored at 41 degrees, and there are different temperature recommendations for different products that you can look up online. At the bottom here, there's a link to our publication on post-harvest handling and transportation of fruits and vegetables. That publication has a nice listing of the different temperature recommendations for various fruits and vegetables. Cut produce, again, we talked about this already, but it's a potentially hazardous food product. And if it stays above 90 degrees for longer than 1 hour, you've got to throw it away. There's just no way around that. So here's a good example. Clean your equipment and your vehicles between uses, and make sure you have, keep that product cool in storage if at all possible. Ice is better than nothing at all. You don't have to have a fancy, cooler or storage facility to do all this. So looking at this cooler here, y'all can probably see how this has some really good examples of things that you want to do. So let's review that. The answers to that question is, it's a lidded container. It has ice on it for cooling that product down. And the nice thing about it is it's a plastic container that's easy to clean and sanitize after each use. So that's really important. So that's a perfect example of how you can cool that product down, even on a small scale, right out of the field overnight or getting it to the market. So what does this all mean? Basically, any produce, whether it's organically grown or conventionally grown, whether from your own backyard or thousands of miles away, it can be contaminated if it's not handled properly. So again, and it's not just at the market that we got to worry about; it's farm to table that we got to worry about as far as food safety. So practice due diligence to make your product safe. Follow those practices that we talked about today, and make sure you do try to keep some records of what you're doing. If nothing else, good records are going to protect you from a liability standpoint. Because if something does come up, if we can rule you out because you've done everything properly, that's a good thing. That's going to protect you in the long run. If you want more information on, farm self-help, if you will, we have a really good publication from the University of Georgia that you can go through a checklist here, sort of an audit of your farm to look at the different practices that you're doing to minimize foodborne pathogens. If you check no to any of the answers on this self-help form, and that means you may need to make some changes to try to increase your good practices that you're trying to implement. These forms and other fact sheets are available online, again, on our website. These are through the University of Georgia on enhancing the safety of locally grown produce. It gets into a lot more detail than what we talked about today, but there's a fact sheet on each one of these different parts of your farm: land use, water use, manure use, worker hygiene, harvesting and storage, all those different things, all the different parts of your process from getting it from farm to the market. And I'd encourage you to look at these fact sheets and sort of audit yourself, if you will, and take the time to do that between now and especially the beginning of the market season. So if your business is growing and you want to know more about how to grow your business, food safety is obviously the first step in the right direction. It's going to open up more markets for you, not just a farmer's market, but maybe local restaurants and things like that. There's a great website called onfarmfoodsafety.org that helps you develop a free food safety plan. You might want to check that out if you're wanting to expand your business, and also consider getting certifications in the future. We don't require the GAP certification at the farmer's market, but if you do want to go to a restaurant or a grocery store chain to expand your business, you're going to have to be GAP certified. So those are kind of the next steps. If you're moving in that direction already, it's going to be a whole lot easier for you to grow your business. If you have any questions, you can call our county extension office anytime. We'll be glad to point you in the right direction or get you in touch with the right people that can help you with getting GAP certified if that's something you want to do. There's a whole agency that does that that's outside of the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but we can definitely get you in touch with the right people. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Do we have any questions right now before we move on to Alexis here? Let's see. It says, do all vendors? I guess we answered all those questions, it looks like. So I will, let's see, I think I stopped my screen share, so Alexis can take over.
All right, hold on. Sorry, let me move this. All right, so hi, my name is Alexis Roberts, and I'm a family and consumer science agent. So my job is kind of more about what happens in the home with our foods and once it gets to market. So that's what I'm going to be reviewing today. All right, so today we're going to talk about, just review some COVID-19 recommendations. We're also going to go over some just potential issues with the safety of produce, and then just review some best practices in general in addition to COVID recommendations. Okay, so we're going to start with COVID. So this is something that's really important, and Paul touched on this. There can absolutely be no eating and drinking or smoking at your vendor booth. Anytime we eat, we drink, we smoke, we're going to touch our hands, or we're going to have saliva droplets that are leaving our mouths. And that's going to be extremely important in helping to prevent the risk of spreading COVID. So if you do feel the need to drink, we're going to ask you to step at least 6 feet away from your booth. And then when you're done, if you have a container, a drink container, please try to store it underneath your booth and away from your food. We also will be suspending all food sampling at this time. This is a recommendation from the Department of Ag and also from the CDC. So there will be no food sampling until further notice. Okay, so this is best practice. So we're going to recommend using gloves when handling money and using and package items for customers. Best practice would actually have different people handling money and different people handling produce if you can. So one of you take money, one of you gives out produce. Just anytime that we take money and we're exchanging hands, we know that money is very dirty. And it also has just a plethora of contact points. So we want to help reduce that as much as possible. We are going to ask you all to wear gloves. Like Paul said, we do anticipate having those for you all for a few weeks. And then if you aren't wearing, we're going to ask you to wear gloves, and then also to hand sanitize. In between that, if you do have any bare hand contact with any of the produce or money. Okay. So we're also going to recommend masks. Like Paul said, this is not required, but this is currently the recommendation. And so the idea around the mask is that it helps to actually prevent you from spreading anything that you have. So we know that sometimes people can be asymptomatic or they don't show symptoms. So this is a way that if we all wear masks, it can cut down on the risk of spreading COVID-19. We're also going to ask you to disinfect your tables and common surfaces regularly as well, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. Okay, so this is going to be a big rule too, and like Regina said, we are working on the spacing for tables. So one of the things we really want to do is customers should not touch anything on your table. So if they want to see how a piece of produce looks, they can ask you to turn it around, but we're asking that they do not touch anything on your table, that even when they come up to your table, there is a little bit of distance. Just as you speak and then we do things, saliva droplets do travel. And so we want to minimize this as much as possible. And we also want to minimize any common touch points, and that could be your table. So we're going to disinfect as much as possible. I think Regina said about every hour, 30 minutes. And then we're going to ask you to either not use any tablecloths or to use a vinyl tablecloth that can be disinfected or sanitized. Cloth tablecloths are not recommended right now. You can use disposable, but I would really caution against it unless you want to have like 6 different ones on hand if you need to.
If you're watching them, they go out.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So I want to go into the difference between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting. So with COVID-19, we actually want to disinfect. So what cleaning does, it just removes food from the countertops or plates. We usually do this with soap or vinegar. So Paul said this already, if a surface is dirty, we actually can't sanitize or disinfect it. That actually goes the same for your hands. So say if you're handling a lot of produce and your hands get dirty, and then you sanitize your hands, that sanitizer is actually not going to be as effective because your hands are dirty. So at that point, there's only so much hand sanitizer that we can use. At a point, sometimes you just need to just go wash your hands. So then sanitizing reduces the number of microorganisms to safe levels, but with COVID-19, we actually disinfect, and disinfecting is actually killing the germs on the surface. So Paul went over a couple of things, some sanitizer recommendations for sanitizing. So for disinfecting, it's actually going to be a little bit more. So this is what the EPA and the CDC is recommending right now. And this is what I would recommend that you have on hand at your table. So you can use about 5 tablespoons of bleach, for 1 gallon of water. Paul also provided a link in his PowerPoint about sanitizers or disinfectants that were recommended for COVID-19. You're also welcome to go to that list. I think making your own is going to be a lot easier and it's going to be easier to do it. You can make that solution in the morning. I would have it labeled. You can just have a little spray bottle and have it labeled with disinfectant spray. And as long as you're doing that every morning before market, because it is going to change its concentration over time, so you'll need to do it every morning. Then this is a solution that you can use to spray down of your table. And I would recommend spraying your table when you get to market. Like Regina said, every 30 minutes to an hour, just as more and more people come up, and then at the end as well. So this is, if you click on the link that Paul sent, this is just kind of what it looks like, or kind of what some of the products are available. So I just wanted to show you all that there are some common products that you can get from the store, like Clorox wipes, or like bathroom cleaning sprays or general purpose cleaning sprays that are available. Okay. Bless someone. Let's see. If you could yourself, if possible, just to decrease the feedback, that would be awesome. Okay. So best practices. So we would like containers that can be cleaned and sanitized in between uses or disinfected. So we are going to ask you not to use any cardboard boxes right now, unless they're the one-time use. So you cannot, this is best practice in general, and we're going to be really serious about this, especially with COVID, that you can use a cardboard box, but you can only use it once. You cannot reuse it. So the main reason for that is because we can't clean it. We can't clean cardboard. There's no way to clean or sanitize or disinfect it. We also know that COVID-19 can stay on cardboard for over 24 hours. So we do want to try to eliminate that as much as possible. So if you do use wooden baskets or wicker baskets, we are going to ask you to line them, like Regina talked about earlier. So things that can be cleaned afterwards. I would honestly recommend even just getting some plastic containers from stores. I think that would just be better during this time to not have any wood out there, just in general. But if you do choose to do that, just make sure it's lined with something that can be cleaned or with disposable paper liners. Stainless steel is also a really good material, or even plastic bins like are in the picture. So like Paul said, 1 in 6 people experience a foodborne illness each year. So there are almost 50 of us on this call. So you can imagine that's quite a few of us. A lot of times we don't know that we get it. So maybe we just have an upset stomach for one night, or we don't really know what's going on with us. But some people aren't as lucky, and unfortunately they get hospitalized, and even some people pass away from it. So we do want to be very mindful of this because it is a very common issue. So these are some symptoms we just want to be aware of: vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, abdominal pain, fever. So like we said, most of the time they're really mild symptoms, but when one thing goes wrong, it can go really wrong. So there's a common one called listeria. Maybe you guys have seen this in the news with like frozen vegetables and things like that. Well, that can actually cause stillbirths in pregnant women. And for the common person, it's okay, but for certain groups, it can be extremely harmful. So we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to protect them. And so as we do with most things, we have outbreaks at farmers markets. So Paul talked about anytime we cut a melon, that's kind of a huge no-no. I really wouldn't recommend it. And so we have an example in 2000 with E. coli that 14 people were sick and 2 elementary school age kids required dialysis, which is a common serious side effect of E. coli. So just from cut melons. We also have a salmonella outbreak from guacamole and salsa, and on cut tamales that 15 people were sick and 3 people were hospitalized as well. So some other common outbreaks at farmers markets can be from lettuce, unpasteurized juices, cheese samples, cut melons, fresh salsa, berries, and then improperly canned products. And of course, if anyone has a canned product, they need to have the required licensor. So this is just a diagram. We just want to show you that a lot of the way that our food, or a lot of causes of foodborne illness outbreaks are actually produce related. So you can see we have fruits and nuts, vines, leafy greens. And so that kind of makes up a little bit more than 40% of our outbreaks. So at farmers markets, so there's some practices when polled. So only 56% indicated that they had hand washing facilities that were available. That is something that we're working on this year, is to have a hand washing station. 53% of fruits and vegetables are not cooled at the market. Like Paul said, you want to make sure you have ice or some sort of protection. Less than 25% sanitized surfaces at the market. So if you think about during the regular season, how many people are coming and talking to you and visiting your table and going to another table, you can imagine how things can really spread if we're not being careful. Only 11% say they clean containers at the market in between uses. So say if you have a foodborne illness in one batch and you don't clean your containers, you could easily spread that to other batches throughout the market season. And 67% of markets allow sampling, but they don't offer any sanitation training to vendors. And one of the top ways that food becomes unsafe is actually through personal hygiene and the way that we handle food. So it's important to be aware of that. Okay, so Paul went over this already, but we want to make sure that we're practicing good personal hygiene. So making sure we know how to wash our hands. I know it seems really silly, and you've probably heard it all in the news, wash your hands for 20 seconds for the millionth time. But it is really critical, and most people actually don't do it. And so this is one of the ways that we know we can actually reduce the pathogens on our skin. So when you do wash your hands, you want to make sure that you get in between your fingers and also on the outside of our hands. That tends to be where we miss things, and also in our fingernails. So making sure that we're doing a really thorough job in taking our time. Excluding sick workers, Paul talked about this already. I'll just say from a public health perspective, this is something that's received a lot more attention in recent years because we know that a lot of the ways that people are becoming sick is that they're bringing it into an establishment. And so we've actually had a few outbreaks. I don't know if you guys remember the Chipotle outbreak like 5 years ago or so. So one of those was actually a worker came to work sick. And the manager was actually fired for that and the employee. So as a farm operator or as a manager of your facility, you are responsible for making sure that people do not come to work sick. And that is something that you can be held liable for. Okay, so this is sampling. I know that we're not doing sampling right now, but this is important, that something that we still wanted to cover. So if that does resume later in the season. You do want to make sure you always wash any produce for samples. I think I haven't seen it at the Cartersville Farmers Market, but I've seen it at other farmers markets where people just like bring out produce and they just like slice it with their knife and they're like, here, have some, and like eat it out of my hand. So that's definitely not recommended. We don't want to do that. You never want to have any bare hand contact with produce or ready to eat foods. So we say ready to eat foods are foods that are not going to receive any further cooking. So you could just eat it. And so we really, that's really a no-go, don't do it. So please have gloves, tongs, or even toothpicks for individual servings. You wanna make sure that you cover servings. I've been to many farmers markets where people just have their samples out. And then you see like flies and stuff, or they're like swatting flies. If you find yourself swatting flies to get them away from your samples, that's probably something you shouldn't be doing. It should probably be covered. Or you can actually have them in the cooler. So if it's cut produce or something that would normally be refrigerated, just go ahead and put it in the cooler so you can have a sign saying that they're in the refrigerator, or you can have a few samples out just for display, and when you give it to someone, you can reach into the cooler and get it. Anything that is a perishable item, if it's out for longer than 1 hour and above 90-degree heat, you need to throw it out. So basically, we know that there are certain temperatures that bacteria likes to grow in, and we call it the temperature danger zone. And when something is 90 degrees, that's something that we call like the temperature danger zone, that bacteria really likes to grow in. So we don't want anything kind of standing out in that heat for that long. Okay, so these are just some common things you may not think about. So if you're doing like a smoothie or things like that at the market, say if you just want to, or you're juicing, this is where a lot of harm comes into play because there's not any sanitizing or any cleaning happening in between that. So say if I start making samples at 8 or at 9, maybe by 11 o'clock, maybe it's 90 degrees, I haven't cleaned that blender, well, there's still that bacteria and that residue that just could continue to build over time. So we do not recommend doing any blended food or any veggies if you don't have a way to properly clean your blender, your utensils. It's not recommended to have pets at the market. I know that we do. So if someone does, I know that you're not allowed to have them when you're selling, but just making sure people do have them leashed up, like say if people come and visit, and that's something that you could definitely advocate towards. Okay. So Regina has already covered that we are not permitting people to sell out of their vehicle unless you need that vehicle to say to keep something cool, like if you have a meat truck or something like that. If you do, we ask that to make sure that your vehicle is clean. So you can kind of see in this video that there's corn, it's in the back of the truck. There's also like this little sack in the background, right? Where did that come from? Doesn't look very clean. Someone's been eating and drinking in the back of the truck as well. So that's another risk that we want to avoid. So we want to make sure if we are selling out of our vehicle, that it is something that we do clean, or you have some sort of tarp down that you have cleaned before you just sell out. This is very dangerous, especially with this ear of corn kind of already open and exposed. And some of it's already shut too, which it should be in the cooler. So this is common that we see in farmers markets. So the wooden boxes or the kind of wicker baskets, they look really attractive, but in terms of food safety, they're extremely unrecommended. So you can kind of see at the top, these are better. They have the burlap sacks in between them. Also kind of what Regina wants with the pricing, you know, how much it costs. A big no-no here is food on the floor. We never want to have food on the floor. I'm sure you can imagine for a lot of reasons. Just if you're kicking up dirt, there's a lot of things that are on our shoes, from feces to bugs to all kind of contaminants. So you always want to have your food at least 6 inches off the ground. We never want to leave food on the ground. And then also with the cardboard boxes, we are not permitting that, only for single use at this time. So those are kind of general, I'm sorry, I think I went through that pretty quick. So those are our general kind of best practices. We want to make sure that we're doing things kind of like Regina said with our market regulations and our code of ethics, also from on the farm all the way to the market. And when we do those things, we can ensure the safety of our community. And so like Paul said, just kind of going through that checklist and saying what are some things that we can improve on, because I think there's always something that we could all do a little bit better. So just making sure that we're doing those things and following best practices. And if you guys have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to the office and we're more than happy to help. And that is the end of my part. Do I have any questions? Let me stop my screen.
Hey, Alexis, I see there's a question from Maxine Sutton on washing vegetables. She wanted to know if you could use Clorox for tomatoes and beans and stuff like that.
So we're, is that, Paul, that might be you. I would say from a consumer base, we're not recommending that anyone use any sort of sanitizer on produce. I know on the farm, there's a little difference.
Yeah, as long as if you're just washing dirt off of the, produce or whatever, you should use clean water or chlorinated water itself. That would be ideal, but you don't need to add any sanitizer to that solution, no.
Please don't. It's actually it can be very unsafe for you. So don't do that, please.
And then the next question is from Ruth. Will there be signs for market attendees that tell them that due to COVID-19, we cannot offer samples and they can't touch anything on the table? I guess that's a question for Regina.
Yes.
There will be signs, okay.
Yes.
And I think Regina plans on having someone there at the market because we are going to try to limit how many people come in. So this will also kind of will be talked about when they arrive as well.
The next question is from Janet. Can you store items under your tables in a closed plastic container, definitely closed with a lid?
I would say it's still not recommended, even if you have like a little pallet or like Regina said, something just to give it some height so it's not on the floor. That would be better.
So Alexis, what about storage? It just sounds like she's asking about storage in a container. Is that okay with like food, like baked goods? What do you
still, the official recommendation is not to have it directly on the floor.
Okay.
So even if it's like, even if you have it like a little cardboard box under it, or I'm trying to even think, or like a thing of wood, I'm trying to think of easy things that you could have. Or like you said with the door stoppers, if you put little 4 door stoppers underneath it or something like that, just to get it off the ground.
We want to minimize that cross-contamination with direct contact on the ground, yeah. The last question is, are we allowed to have pet treat samples? I would say probably no as well, because that's just as much of a risk as far as touching. You're feeding the animal, so you're going to be touching the animal's mouth, and you could be transferring pathogens just as easily as human pathogens. So, again, at least for the time being with COVID-19, let's stay away from samples, even pet samples. Another question just came in from Maxine. Would it be possible to offer customers hand sanitizer so they could choose their produce?
I would say that's still unrecommended, and that's kind of, so UGA has a publication out, and the Department of Ag has adopted this publication as their policy, and the policy is to not have customers touch things on your table. Because what if they don't like it and they touch it, you know? And like, what if they're talking and their saliva droplet gets on it? I know it may seem really silly, but we just have to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to reduce the risk as much as possible.
And I'd also add to that you know, it's all about perception right now. The fact that we can even keep this farmers market operating is sort of a privilege, and we've got to make a good appearance. And we don't want our customers touching products at the market. And in some ways, you know, y'all can control that because every vendor has their own space. You know, if y'all are bagging that produce and handing it to the customers, you know, there's no customers touching that product. That's better than a grocery store can do, if you think about it. That's an ideal situation to be in. So that's what we should be doing in the farmers market is making sure that customers are not touching that produce. That's going to be a solid rule that we need to enforce. And I think some of our marketing and messaging, you know, needs to sort of swing that way too, that in some ways, you know, our products are safer than the grocery store. Because if you've ever been to a grocery store, you know, just walk through the produce aisle and see how many times people touch those apples and bananas throughout the day. It's a pretty scary situation if you think about it. So, one more question: does it matter what kind of bags we use?
No,
No.
I would say so.
No. All right. Are there any other questions? Anybody want to turn on their microphone and ask a question, or keep using the chat box?
Paul, I do want to say for all of the vendors who have been here throughout the entire training session, if you could send me your name through chat, because a lot of you, some of you are listed, but some of you are listed by your device. So if you could send your name so I could keep a record of your attendance, that would be great. Thank you.
One more bag question about used bags. You don't want to reuse, especially grocery store bags and things that have had something else in them previously, because that's just asking for problems as far as contamination. You know, if your customers bring, I guess, the fabric bags or whatever, I mean, that's their own, that's on them to wash their bags and that sort of thing. By the way, a lot of people don't wash those, but that's a recommended practice. That's why they make the grocery store bags out of cloth, so you can wash them between uses. So that's an education thing that we need to work on with our customers probably. But I mean, if they want to use that bag and you put the product in that bag, that's fine. But we don't need to be handing reused bags to our customers.
Angelina said she got a question about curbside pickup. Regina, do you want to touch on that?
What was the question?
Will we be offering like curbside pickup or those options?
I think that depends on staffing. So I guess I need to talk to Katie and see, she's on this training session. It just depends on staffing right now. I don't think we have enough, but you know, Shane had talked about earlier, like their specific customers. Maybe if someone calls AM Farms and orders something, he can do, you know, curbside. But right now we don't have the staffing for it. But we would like to, we're open to trying to work something out if we have enough volunteers.
Yeah, it looks like most folks are just putting their names in the chat box, and if they're attending with somebody, that's good. Yeah, it shows we have 48 people on the screen, but some of y'all have 2 or 3 people sitting at the screen, so that's good. It's good for us to know. All right, any other last minute questions? I would say thank you all again for coming out. You know, we would have loved to have done this in person. That's what we had intended to do originally. But this is the next best thing as far as trying to get the information to you and make our market as safe as possible for the public this year.
We have one more question. Should you change gloves after each transaction? No. So best practice would be to have one person that handles produce and then have one person that handles like money transactions. So if you could do that, that would be better. If you are by yourself after handling money, I would recommend changing gloves after handling produce. but it would be better to have 2 people at your table.
Could you sanitize the glove after you use it? This is Bobby.
No, with gloves, they're single use, so it is not recommended to use hand sanitizer on your gloves. I would almost say, like, if you're worried about
Could you like,
one thing you could do, I would say, is like when you're doing money, I would take and like you could take your gloves off. I know that seems silly, and sanitize that way. And then when you're doing produce, put your gloves back on, and then just try to wash your hands every 30 minutes, so it's not building up on your hands, because you can feel it when hand sanitizer builds up on your hands when you wash it. That would be like a better option. So like when you handle money, take your gloves off, sanitize after, and then put back your gloves on when you handle produce. I know that seems really silly, but that would be better.
could you like stage a separate table like in front of your display to put the product on and let them leave the money there, and then you just walk out and take the money and they come and pick the product up to keep from having to assure 6 foot of space?
So I know we've been talking about, and a lot of farmers markets are doing this, where you may actually have a tape line in front of your tent or your booth that's 6 feet away from your table, basically. And so the customers never get any closer than that. So basically, I mean, 6 feet is like 2 arm lengths away. So you can both reach across as far as money or transactions, moving produce 6 feet away. That's a good distance, a safe distance, if you will, for those interactions. Another table may not be necessary, but some people may, if you have more than one person that you can work, again, where you have separation of duties, one's doing the money, one's doing the bagging of the produce. You may even want to separate those 2 people 6 feet apart and have 2 stopping points for your customers, All right. Any other words of wisdom from Alexis or Regina?
No, just thank you all for attending, and just email us with any other questions that you may have.
Regina, did you want to talk about gift certificates at all, briefly?
Yeah, we will have gift certificates this year in $10 increments. Paul, you had more, I don't know, we talked about this briefly.
Yeah.
You talked about the gift certificate.
So we've been talking about being able to sell gift certificates for the market. And so we've come up with a way to make just a generic gift certificate that people could spend at any of the, primarily produce, I think is what we were thinking about. And these would be incentives that we could give out to SNAP participants, for things that we're doing and other programs. But we could also sell those, in general, if somebody wanted to sell a gift certificate, or we could sell those at the market. But they will be notarized with a stamp and a signature on it. So there wouldn't be any way for anybody to duplicate those gift certificates. And again, it would be optional for you as a vendor to accept those gift certificates. But if you're already accepting EBT payments, that would be easy to just turn those in at the end of the day, along with your EBT tokens. And then we'll add that to your total when we cut you a check at the end of the week. So it's real easy for us to track that, money in, money out. If somebody, doesn't have exact, as far as the product that they're buying isn't exactly $10, you could give them cash back and you're still going to get your $10 when you cash it in at the end of the day. So, that's something that I just wanted y'all to be aware of, that we're going to try that out this year. And if y'all see any problems with that, if you're accepting those, give us some feedback and let us know if you have any suggestions on how to improve that process. Yeah, I guess we answered all the questions then. All right. Well, thank you all again for coming out, and I hope y'all got something valuable out of this. We did record this, hopefully. It's the first time I tried to record one of these. If all else fails, we can definitely get you a copy of the slides. We can email those to you guys, and You can look over that with more information if you need to. And our websites that we mentioned too, we'll share those links so you can go back and refer to that information. So if there's nothing else, we look forward to seeing y'all hopefully starting on May 2nd with our beginning market season. So I wish y'all the best. Stay healthy, protect yourselves and each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Regina, if you could hit the stop record button.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.